Hello, everybody, and welcome to, unusually for us, a lunchtime lecture. Um, for those who don't know me, although I suspect most of you do, I'm Aviva Dorch. I'm the executive director of Jewish Renaissance magazine. And over the last few weeks and next week, we've been running a series on prison Jewish arts. But we were temporarily stepping out of that. So with the new time comes a new theme, although there is also a Paris connection, which I'm sure Monica will talk about later. But today's session is about the Anglo-American artist Jacob Epstein, mainly because tomorrow a group from Jewish Renaissance are heading off to the Midlands, including to Walsall Gallery, which is where the Epstein archive and collections is now held. By the way, one person had to withdraw because of family circumstances, so there's still one place left for that, should anyone be interested. But Monica will be leading the group tomorrow, and taking them to see some of Epstein's sculptures and correspondence, in fact, in person. So we thought today she should kick off by teaching his life and writing. Again, I'm sure most of you, if not all, know Monica, but she's the founding director of Insiders Outsiders, and she is also on the Jewish Renaissance editorial board. She's our art reviewer and art consultant, and we're delighted to have her with us today. So thank you, Monica, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Aviva. And I think without further ado, let me start screen sharing. Just double check it's all working as it should do. How does that look? Hold on, let's go full screen.
Great.
All good?
Yeah, you just need to shift to that's it.
Yes, lovely. Very good. So, Let There Be Sculpture. You may be wondering where that very biblical sounding title comes from. It comes quite simply from Epstein's own memoir, autobiography that he wrote, interestingly enough, during the Second World War. It was published in 1940. And it's a good title, isn't it? I mean, I think we'd all agree with that. But it also, I think, very tellingly gives us a sense immediately of the scope of his aspirations, his ambitions as a sculptor. I will say no more for the moment. A very telling quotation. 1933, British art historian, A Short History of English Sculpture. I'll read it out, although I hardly need to. Epstein's ancestry and early environment go far to explain his art. This is essentially Oriental. Epstein is with us, but not of us. Well, one could spend a long time, I think, unpacking this rather extraordinary, double-edged kind of statement here. I mean, first of all, essentially Oriental. What on earth does that mean? This kind of fudging of origins is something we will see again and again and again as we move through his life and career. But perhaps as importantly for my introductory purposes, Epstein is with us, but not of us. Now, Aviva's kindly mentioned my Insiders Outsiders project, and Epstein wasn't, in fact, a refugee from Nazism, as you're probably aware. But I think this insider-outsider simultaneous sort of tension, if you like, between the two senses of who you might be applies to him as much as to any other of the artists included in the Insiders Outsiders project, and indeed to many other artists besides from other periods. With us, but not of us. So where did he come from? I start with the films still. I imagine many of you will have seen this rather wonderful 1975 film called Hester Street, and it's here into this milieu, emphatically Jewish, Yiddish-speaking, Orthodox environment into which Jacob Epstein is born. His parents were immigrants from Poland and Russia. They themselves were born there. They give birth to Epstein in the Lower East Side. Not on the poverty line. They were actually, relatively speaking, for that wave of immigrants, fairly not affluent exactly, but comfortably off, not too impoverished. Having said that, though, that the son's aspirations to become an artist, not to mention a sculptor, seemed to them entirely mysterious. They couldn't understand how he could possibly be interested in such an obviously not profitable career path, but they didn't actually obstruct those ambitions, which is just as well for him. In contrast, I mean, you know, we've talked, haven't we, about, I gave a talk on the École de Paris, think of Soutine and the fact that he was beaten and locked in a cellar for daring put pen to paper, or even, you know, the likes of Bomberg and, who I'll come back to, and Gertler from the Whitechapel generation coming into this world into a very similar milieu to that into which Epstein was born. Epstein, at least, you know, met no concrete obstacles to his ambitions. Nevertheless, I think, you know, it's fair to say that this environment was not immediately conducive to dreaming of becoming an artist. And just very briefly, here's Epstein himself again recollecting the debt he owes to his origins, which he soon leaves behind. He leaves Jewish orthodoxy behind also fairly promptly. But I realize what I owe to its unique and crowded humanity. And as you can see from this rather early self-portrait, he's what, all of 21 at this point, rather dandyish, rather almost coquettish, isn't it? Quite extraordinary, really. I think it's revealing of a very different mindset to that which would have prevailed in the Lower East Side, in most people's mindsets. So ambitions of a very different nature. Now, by this time, he is indeed training as an artist. He's trying to sort of fulfill those ambitions. He, first of all, studies at a relatively progressive art school in New York City, in Manhattan, called the Art Students League. Here's just briefly a photograph of its quite grand exterior. He also works as an apprentice in a bronze foundry and takes evening classes. I should say straight away, and I think it's becomes very evident, you know, that he's a little bit like Chagall, actually, in a very different context. He kind of is always chafing at the bit. He's kind of rebelling against his teachers. He's never really wanting to toe the line in any sort of conventional sense. Now, this is his first major achievement. A publication that is printed, as you can see, in 1902. He's still a very young man. He's in his early 20s. Written, interestingly enough, not by a Jewish writer. Hutchins Hapgood was, I suppose you could say, a Philo-Semite. Not enough of them around, sadly, as we know. But a literary text which Epstein was commissioned to produce the illustrations for. Let me give you a taste. I mean, I think you can already see how wonderfully kind of fluid and vivid and sort of, yeah, full of life, full of teeming with vitality these images are. Quite possibly more vivid than any photograph could be. And here's another one. So this is important, obviously, for our purposes, very interesting that here he is declaring his allegiances to his home, you know, his early years, quite unabashedly and without any embarrassment. But it's also very important in his career as a stepping stone to moving somewhere very, very different indeed, to Paris. So it was on the basis of the revenue coming to him from this commission, with a little bit of help from a number of important philanthropists, not even philanthropists, but they were people who kind of became his mentors and patrons, who also gave him enough money to make it possible for him to cross the Atlantic. He does this in 1902, so just almost immediately after the book was published. Like so many now, he's actually come to Paris rather earlier than most of the artists I discussed in my lecture recently on the École de Paris. I think it was Pasquin who came in 1905. So he's there just a smidge earlier, when in fact the Jewish School of Paris hadn't yet sort of formed itself. But it's very much, even in 1902, it is absolutely the place where you had to come. Think Picasso, think many other artists, besides, if you wanted to make it as an artist of any seriousness, particularly in the avant-garde world. Now, I don't know how much you know about Parisian sort of the art world scene, but you know, the École de Beaux-Arts, look at its grand building, was very much, it was the equivalent really of the Royal Academy of Arts, although it was formed much earlier in Paris. And Epstein ends up attending classes there, but as you might expect, he didn't take too kindly to the rather conventional academic training that prevailed within its sacred, sort of hallowed portals. And he soon made a switch to a much more, if you like, a kind of alternative, less fully academic teaching institution known as the Académie Julian, which incidentally was one of the very few places that also took women students. That's entirely by the way, but I think not irrelevant. And here too, he didn't necessarily get on well with all his teachers, or indeed with all the students. He was very much, a loner. He was absolutely driven from a very, very early age to make art, and that really was something that he put first over, sort of lounging around in cafes, or indeed having lots of girlfriends at this point. Now, before we move the focus to London, which is where, as you probably know, he makes his home thereafter, I just want to pause briefly for those of you who perhaps aren't that au fait with art historical terms, or with the notion of realism versus the avant-garde. These are two artists, two sculptors of great repute, whom, well, we know that in fact Epstein, he met Rodin, and although he wasn't completely sure about his relatively naturalistic sort of carvings, such as his famous kiss on the left there, we have a version, of course, in the Tate. Nevertheless, he admired his sheer artistry, his consummate, craftsmanship, and his vigor. Constantine Brancusi is an interesting case. I'm not sure whether they actually met face to face, but Brancusi was actually of Romanian, not Jewish, but Romanian origin. The story is that he actually walked all the way from Romania to Paris, so determined was he to kind of become part of the avant-garde in the early 20th century. And as you can see from this wonderful, same subject, you can see why I put the two together, but utterly different image of a couple embracing. He is rejecting the relative naturalism of Rodin and his disciples and saying, no, I want to do something different. I want to turn more towards the idea of primitivism, a kind of almost raw reductiveness in what I produce. So Brancusi was certainly an inspiration, even if they didn't meet face to face. And I'll come back to that notion later. Well, why does he leave Paris, the great centre of the art world, and come to London, of all places? There are some clues in his own writings. Other people have analysed or sort of grappled with the question. I have a feeling, from my sense of who Epstein was and what kind of personality he was, that he had a sense that actually he might come to prominence more emphatically, if I can put it that way, in, if you like, the smaller art pond that was early 20th century London than in Paris, which, as I think we've discovered, it was absolutely teeming in the early 20th century with numerous, gigantic talents all jostling, if you like, for a place in the sun. And I think, that's part of the reason. He's still very young. He's still a student. He's still flexing his muscles. He wants to make his mark. The other reason, as so often happens, is that he had met somebody called Margaret. Her name she's often known by is Margaret Williams, also Margaret Dunlop. She was actually an Englishwoman. They met in Paris. She was married at the time. They strike up, if not a love affair immediately, but a chord is struck. And it's very, very likely that perhaps the overriding reason for his decision to move to London in 1905 was in fact that budding love affair, and Margaret was indeed to become his wife very shortly after, and what a long-suffering wife she was. He had multiple affairs. She couldn't have children. She was very, very tolerant of him having children with other women. Well, what can one say? I'll leave you to judge for yourselves, but nevertheless, she remains an absolutely central figure in his life. So he comes to London. He's lucky because right from the start, he has certain patrons, certain people who are eminent and, influential people in the British art scene who felt strongly that he was a major talent who had to be duly recognised, indeed given commissions. For example, Augustus John, the great Bohemian, again, rather sort of womanizing, amoral avant-garde figure, was one such admirer. Somebody else who's worth mentioning is Sir Charles Holden, who was actually an architect, but of a very tolerant avant-garde persuasion who actually commissioned many, not just of Epstein's, but of many of the most sort of radical sculptural projects, to go architectural projects, that is, of the early 20th century in London. And one such example was this one here. And I wonder if any of you have actually spotted these sculptures, albeit in their defaced, rather sorry state. It's just if you're standing outside Charing Cross Station looking across the road, you just turn your eyes to the right, and it's now Zimbabwe House. And they're high up, easy to miss, but they're still there. This was his first public commission. And like so many in his life, as we will soon discover, it met with very, very mixed response. As ever, there was a hardcore, if you like, of supporters who defended him against often utterly vituperative, vitriolic sorts of criticism. Just read this. Almost funny, but not really. Father Bernard Vaughan we're going to come across again. He happened to be a Jesuit priest and clearly, you know, seething, isn't he, with a kind of moral outrage. Think back to that quotation that I started with. He is with us, but not of us, from somebody who actually supported Epstein's work. This is a much more negative take, isn't it? But on that same sense of him absolutely not belonging, and indeed being a kind of moral threat to the respectability, the decency of British culture. And an anonymous article in the Evening Standard, again, you know, sort of not quite as ghastly, but actually, you know, sort of very much along the same lines, that there was something deeply foreign, alien, threatening, subversive about this work. It's perhaps hard for us to see now, but I will be showing, as I carry on today, some examples of other work by British sculptors. And I think you'll begin to see how raw, how, in a sense, I was going to say primeval, but, you know, it's sort of primordial, perhaps is a better sense of getting down to the very basics, a kind of unashamed nudity that is very much about the kind of getting down to the very essence of human existence and the different ages of man and woman, which for most British folk was simply a step too far. Let us not convert London into a Fiji island. I absolutely love that. Okay. Now, his next major commission takes us, in fact, back to Paris. The commission came from London, but as you may know, Oscar Wilde died in Paris. He was buried, in fact, in a different place, and then was, what's the word, exhumed, and his remains brought to Père Lachaise, the famous cemetery which contains so many famous people's remains in Paris. And this also, I haven't got time to go into details, but this led him to revisit Paris, to renew some of the relationships with the Parisian avant-garde that he had already begun to make when he was a student, but obviously to consolidate others. And as you can see from this photograph, it's actually quite extraordinary. I can't remember, I think this is actually a fairly recent picture that actually, unlike most of the monuments, and it's certainly one of the more remarkable ones, it continues to be, is it defaced, but certainly to be sort of engaged with in perhaps unacceptable sorts of ways. What's it influenced by? Again, this brings up the subject of looking elsewhere for inspiration. Let me just first of all show you a rather beautiful sketch. And Epstein was, and I think this immediately proves that, he was a wonderful, and we've seen the self-portrait after all from his early years, he was a consummate draftsman as well. He had tremendous assurance, but also fluency of touch. Some of you may recognize the obvious inspiration. It's one of the Assyrian, more generically perhaps, but also quite specifically, the Syrian winged bulls from the British Museum. And this brings me to say something really important, that actually one of his main inspirations in his early London life, and indeed even beyond that, was the huge variety of different non-Western cultures and their artifacts that he could explore at his leisure in the British Museum. So from the very, very start, a tremendous admiration for alternative cultures, a move away from what was seen in many, many quarters. He was by no means the only artist to feel this way, from the sort of over-decadent, over-sophisticated post-Renaissance tradition. And here the allegiance is very, very clear indeed. Just going back to the sculpture itself, it's worth mentioning that originally, and perhaps ironically, given that we tend to think of London as being more prudish than, than Paris, it was actually the Paris authorities who threw up their hands in absolute horror. They actually laid a tarpaulin over the sculpture, almost as though they want, they were quite literally hiding it from view. Then they constructed a kind of a metal plate to cover the genitals of the figure, and it was actually at one point removed, as you can see. That's no longer the case. But what an extraordinary thing that even in Bohemian or apparently sort of much laxer Paris, this should raise such a brouhaha. And as I say, ironically, in London, actually, for the most part, it actually met with a good reception, although perhaps the fact that it was in a Paris cemetery rather than the London one helped. So back to London. Now, one of the drawings that I didn't show you that actually appeared as an illustration to the Spirit of the Ghetto book way back in 1902 in New York was the one on the top left-hand corner. And I put it together with a drawing, rather wonderful drawing by David Bomberg, who, as I've already mentioned, came from a very similar background, but he grew up in Whitechapel, in London's equivalent, if you like, of the Lower East Side, namely the Whitechapel area. Why do I put the two together? Well, partly for that very reason, partly because they actually became good friends and indeed allies and colleagues because, and particularly, and interestingly for our purposes, in 1914, they were actually asked to co-curate the Jewish section of an exhibition held at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, which I'm sure you are aware of, still very much alive and well today, on the right there, summer exhibition called 20th Century Art, a Review of Modern Movements. Now, isn't that interesting? A Jewish section within this modern art show. Now, again, I'd be tempted, I haven't got time to go into this, but it's a kind of double-edged thing, isn't it? On the one hand, to celebrate the achievements of the many Anglo Jewish artists, but also the work of Jewish artists from Paris. Epstein's own work was included from America as well, but also to segregate them out, not so sure. Is that necessarily a good thing? I'll leave you to think about that for yourselves. But certainly here too, in Paris, in London, he's quite unabashedly identifying as a Jew within British culture. One of the artists who was featured in the Whitechapel exhibition is Amedeo Modigliani, who some of you will remember I mentioned, very major figure of Italian Jewish descent, but comes to Paris, becomes a leading figure in the so-called École Juive, or the École de Paris. And here are two works by him, not necessarily the ones that were shown at Whitechapel, but of this ilk for sure. Also, like Brancusi and like Epstein, as we'll see, very much a pioneering figure in the concept of direct carving. No preliminary sketches, no plaster maquettes, then transposed into different medium. You cut straight into the stone. Again, very much in admiration of so-called primitive art. He was also a wonderful draftsman, as you can see from the work on the right. Notice the emphatic use of blue outlines, if that's the word, not quite the right word, to lend vigor to this beautiful drawing. We'll see that Epstein almost certainly was looking sideways, if you like, at what Modigliani was doing. So Modigliani, both somebody who had become a friend when Epstein was visiting Paris in preparation for this 1914 show, but also somebody who was an sort of artistic inspiration for him. Now, direct carving. Two more examples here on the top left, a slightly, sort of risque. It doesn't look particularly risque to us now, but the idea that the doves are obviously copulating, to put it politely, raised a few eyebrows when this work was shown in London. But as you can see, also very reductive, very hands-on in its sort of engaging with the marble. At this point, around 1914, just before the outbreak of the First World War, Epstein was very much mingling with members of the British avant-garde, and particularly the group known as the Vorticists. Now, I haven't, again, got time to go into details, but suffice it to say that we're talking about Wyndham Lewis, controversial figure, rather right-wing in his political views, just by the way, but also Ezra Pound, as you can see here, William Roberts, and Henri Gaudibreschka, who's an interesting figure. He was of French birth, but actually comes to London with his Polish lover, Sophie Breszka, and takes on her name unusually. He dies tragically in the First World War, which I'll come to in a minute. But I think you can see by me aligning these two images that there's something quite similar, isn't there, in their way to the rather more sort of schematic, but also very, kind of confident reduction of forms to their essentials. Epstein, he never signed manifestos, but nevertheless, I think in his admiration for something brand new and radical in art, he certainly sympathized with quite a few of the vorticist's aims. Back to his admiration for non-Western art. I mean, look at this. This is almost too neat, isn't it? But here we are then, sort of around the time of the First World War, where he's showing quite, again, unashamedly, his profound admiration, not slavish copying of, not by any means, but his profound admiration for the greater vitality, as he saw it, the anti-naturalism of nearly all, in fact, African tribal sculpture. And it won't therefore surprise you to learn that Epstein himself he amassed a fabulous collection of African art, some of which, incidentally, those of you who will be joining me in Walsall tomorrow will have a chance to admire at first hand. Now, we're still with the First World War. This is not about the First World War, but maybe it is. This was another radical and in many quarters controversial work, one of his most extraordinary and innovative achievements, I think you might agree with me, of sketch on the left, which is even more pounding with energy, isn't it, than the final sculpture, the rock drill. It's radical in many ways, not least because it's actually using a mass-produced rock drill as the armature, if you like, the stand for this plaster robotic figure, a very, very, very radical thing to be doing in art in 1913 or thereabouts. What exactly is the relationship between man and machine? I find it deeply ambiguous. Can he control the machine? I think it's an open question. What's very, very interesting is that actually as the First World War progresses, he destroys the plaster. In fact, he destroys the whole work, as you will have noticed there. The image on the right is actually a reconstruction done much, much later. So he destroys the original piece. And what he does instead is to reconfigure, if you like, to remake a bronze version of just the torso of this machine man. And look how different it is. Look how different it is. And I'll put the two together because I think you can see that by so doing, he's almost admitted the failure of mankind. It sounds rather pretentious, but to control the machine universe that he has created. There's a sense of defeat, is there not? Almost humiliation. Certainly look at the way the limbs, I should have said this, it's obvious. The arms are truncated, maimed, mutilated. And this, the bronze mutilated torso, is all that remained in his lifetime. Now, he did serve, he was conscripted in 1917. Here is a photograph of Private Epstein. Note the Jewish battalion he ends up in. The only work, to my knowledge, that is quite literally, sort of about the war in a much more obvious sort of sense, is this work here, which is obviously a celebration of the both the suffering, but also I think the resilience of the British Tommy, the World War I soldier, called often the tin hat. It's, I think, a real tin hat that was used, 1916. But he has a nervous breakdown, and he's actually allowed to leave. He's discharged from active service, which I think is telling. And one of his next major works is the famous, again notorious work called The Risen Christ, started while the war is still raging. Remember Father Vaughan? Roman Catholic, Jesuit, okay? I mean, again, look, I'm not going to read it out. Look at the rather grotesque crass, ignorant conflation of every possible brand of otherness in terms of cultures and origins. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. But it absolutely reiterates and kind of reinforces this sense of both Epstein and his work being thoroughly unchristian, and with their its references to utterly alien cultures, totally un-British, totally unacceptable. Very briefly, I just want to remind us what, in a sense, this is up against. There's the Epstein. You probably all know, I mean, you know, this sort of utterly over-reproduced, certainly in certain British households, not so much now, of course, but, you know, the sort of pre-Raphaelite Holman Hunt, the light of the world. This is the kind of, dare I say it, slightly saccharine imagery that many Christian households would be used to. In contrast, what Epstein's work is clearly paying homage to is the hieratic, static magnificence of the monumental dignity of the kind of mosaics. This is not necessarily the exact prototype, but it certainly could have been the kind of topos, if you like, of Christ in Majesty from Ravenna, from Byzantine mosaics. And I think you can see, without me taking it any further, how close they are, both in form and perhaps in spirit as well. There is also a very Jewish aspect to Epstein's engagement and fascination with the figure of Jesus. I will read this because this is absolutely pertinent for us. So he's referring to the risen Christ. Retrospectively, again, it's in his memoir of 1940, so he's writing from the Second World War perspective in all its darkness. So it stands and accuses the world for its grossness, inhumanity, cruelness, and beastliness for the First World War. The Jew, the Galilean, please note, i.e. Jesus, I'm going to come back to that, condemns our wars and warns us that shalom, shalom, must still be the watchword between man and man. So the notion of a Jewish Jesus is clearly really interesting. As I say, we'll come back to it. He remained fascinated with Christian iconography, but handled in often a very non-conventional sort of way throughout his life, really from then on. Here then, for example, is a relatively naturalistic bronze, this time, of a Madonna and Child. This will be quite interesting again for those of you who are coming to on the trip tomorrow. On our second day, we'll be stopping at St. Matthew's Church and seeing the Henry Moore, Mother and Child. We will think about this. And I put that one on also because one of the criticisms that was often leveled at Epstein again and again throughout his life was his, as it was seen, dubious kind of proclivity for non-British models. And one example of that, let me just flick back to her features, was his use, and she certainly wasn't the only one, of exotic looking, emphatically not British, not English looking models. And Sunita Devi, as her name suggests, she was in fact an Indian dancer who became his model, probably his mistress, and certainly appears in many of his works of the 1920s. And here are some images that illustrate that. 1925, more controversy. How am I doing over time? This is a work that you can see. Well, you've already heard about the works on the Strand. One can really do a walking tour of Epstein's work, extant works in London. It's not difficult to do. And there are indeed websites that will guide you on your way. Very near the Serpentine Art Gallery, the Serpentine River. This one, again, do you know when this was unveiled? It was a memorial to the writer W.H. Hudson. Rima was one of the characters in one of his books, a kind of wild, almost feral woman inhabiting the jungle. When this was unveiled, it was considered so outrageous, there was even debated in Parliament whether or not it should be removed. Once again, there were staunch supporters, but your man in the street, woman in the street probably as well, and many people who were not au fait, if you like, with avant-garde art said, absolutely unacceptable. I'll just show you quickly where it is. There you are. That's part of the wider memorial in situ. And here are just 2 pages from one of his many sketchbooks relating, I mean, he didn't just do sketches. They're not prototypes for the work themselves, but he's kind of working out his ideas in very fluent and vivid fashion, as you can see, for Rima, as indeed for many other projects. And if you think back to the, do you remember the Modigliani drawing with its use of blue? I'm willing to bet that here, consciously or unconsciously, Epstein is paying tribute, if you like, to Modigliani, who in fact had died in 1920. And also, again, I think it's really useful just to remind ourselves why his work seems so unacceptable, quite so radical. If you're used to Peter Pan, for example, just a few hundred yards away from Rima, or indeed the idealized naturalism of the World War I memorial, also not so very far away in Hyde Park Corner, you begin to see why this should be deemed completely abhorrent. So much so, and again, it's very interesting to look at the kind of way in which the negative responses to his most radical works are infiltrated, if you like, inextricably mixed up with racism, with anti-Semitism. And this is, sadly, I have to say, reinforced by the fact that in 1935, a group calling themselves the Independent Fascist Party actually daubed swastikas on this work. That was the most kind of virulent physical attack, but it comes out in words as well. And I think it's interesting, just again, very, very briefly, Eric Gill, I wonder if you've heard about him. He's often seen also as a pioneering figure in the use of direct carving in modern British, early 20th century British sculpture. Pretty, sort of suspect in his private life. I won't go into that. There's been some debate. They had a slightly prickly, uneasy relationship, Gill and Epstein. They did know each other. They even worked together on certain projects, most of which came to nothing. But here is Gill. Again, you can see this for yourselves in Portland Place. Portland Place. If I just go back to that, I think you can see how, all things being relative, perhaps, there's a kind of slightly effete, attenuated quality, isn't there? Slightly fey quality to Gill, which makes Epstein feel much more red-blooded, if you like. Who you prefer is up to you, of course. But I think also just looking at the resemblance in the composition between this and that, and given this is 1925, this is 1932, I can't help wondering if Eric Gill is borrowing perhaps a little bit shamelessly from Epstein. Another major project, again, big fuss. This, once again, you can see, in fact, the building is a fascinating one because it was, again, Sir Charles Holden who commissioned a whole bevy of quite well-known avant-garde British sculptors to adorn the facades of the new London Underground Electric Railways headquarters. It's now St James's, it's the building that houses St James's Park Underground Station, so do go and look for yourselves. Here then are 2 remarkable, again, sort of monumental, in-your-face images, day and night, by Epstein. Full frontal nudity, as you can see on the left there, which raised more than a few eyebrows, so much so that he was actually persuaded that he'd better kind of, what shall I say, politely trim, if you like, the private parts of the young boy there on the left. Notice also the Pietà reference on the right. Also worth mentioning that one of the youngest sculptors to be commissioned for this building was Henry Moore. Henry Moore's first public commission. And I've put for the record one of the things that Henry Moore wrote actually following Epstein's death in the late 1950s. He took the brickbats for modern art, and as far as sculpture in this country is concerned, he took them first. And I think that's really important as well. We're exploring perhaps his Jewishness, his sense of being insider and outsider, but in terms of his pioneering position within the avant-garde, this really does say it all. As the 1930s go on their way, you can see that he's still not trying to shock, but he's producing monumental pieces which are very much in your face. They're emphatically sensual, sexual, full of a kind of raw energy, which once more to some people was pretty suspect. Remarkable works. This one, you may recall this from the Tate. This is actually in one of the lobbies at Tate Britain. I think interesting to see the sketch. Again, not, it's not the exact prototype, very rhythmic, very, very energetic. It becomes much more hieratic and still and primitivizing, if you like, in the final marble piece. And notice how many of the, look at the subjects, Old Testament without question. This should make us pause for thoughts. I mean, I've talked about the way he often raised eyebrows, but believe it or not, this work here, Jacob with the Wrestling with the Angel, was actually toured around the country during the Second World War as a kind of attraction to be mocked and scorned. You paid your penny or whatever it was, and you could go and mock outside Louis Tussaud's waxworks in Blackpool. It really is extraordinary, isn't it? Now, what about his family? We'll be hearing much more about this in Walsall itself. I've already intimated that he had a very colourful love life. I haven't once more got time to go into details, but suffice, I'll just give you kind of, a taste of it now, and the kind of complex family networks. Lucian Freud, this is a rather wonderful, shows his handsome intensity. Lucian Freud married Epstein's daughter Kitty. Now, Kitty was not the daughter of the long-suffering Margaret. She was the daughter of Catherine Garman, who had become Epstein's mistress really quite early on. I think they met in 1921, or is it even earlier? Yes, 1921, they started their relationship. They remained lovers for several decades. They only married actually just at the very end of Epstein's life. And yeah. So Lucian Freud then becomes Epstein's son-in-law, and there he is immortalized by his father-in-law. And here are two quite extraordinary images. They may well be familiar to you from Lucian Freud's early work. You probably guessed it. They're both using Kitty as his model. And look how fraught with a kind of emotional, intensity, ambiguity, tension they are. Wow. Now, Epstein actually from very, very early on, we know that one of the very first sculptures he produced as a student in Paris even was of a baby's head. He was fascinated by the beauty and also I think also the sensuality of small children. And these are just three that give you a sense of that. So we've got a very early work here done in Paris, in fact, bearing that out. We've got on the bottom there, top right, Peggy Jean, who was actually his first child from neither Margaret nor Catherine, another lover, another mistress. And on the right, on the bottom there, this is Kitty again, his beloved daughter. Just going back to that, you can see how Lucian Freud has actually captured her broad features, indeed inherited very largely, I think, from her father. So more about all that tomorrow, but I will just carry on a little bit on that front. Theodore Garman, Theo was a son, not a daughter this time, born to Kathleen Garman, Epstein being the father. He has a rather sad, I think, portrait. You can get a sense from the photograph, and incidentally, it's by Ida Carr, who's a really fascinating Armenian-born photographer who took some fantastic photographs of many, many different people within the British art world in the 1950s, certainly somebody to look out for, and earlier, but particularly in the 50s. He had mental issues. He would die very young, but he was also a rather good painter. Just to give you a flavour of that. Inherits quite clearly something of the kind of vitality and energy of his father. And here then is Kathleen. You can read the caption for yourself. Now, Margaret, the wife, Epstein's wife, actually dies in 1947, but for some reason, one would have to have asked Epstein himself, he doesn't actually marry Kathleen, who has not only been his mistress, but given birth to his children over several decades. He only marries her in 1954. Quite extraordinary. Now, she's a fascinating woman in her own right, as you might expect. And I will just urge those of you who are not coming with us to read this book here. The cover on the left, it's a very, very readable and quite racy account of not just Kathleen herself, absolutely gorgeous, as you can see, but also her two sisters. They were quite a trio, and they had relationships, mostly love affairs, not always, with many really eminent figures within the British and indeed sometimes the American art world as well. It's a very, very good read, and I heartily recommend it. Okay, so coming to a close very shortly, I want to just give you a sense of his output of his later years. He's doing very well, thank you. He's getting plenty of commissions. He's, of course, getting older, not very old, but certainly older. His personal life, although he formalizes his relationship in due course with Kathleen, but it's also very much touched by tragedy. I've mentioned Theo's death in the mid-1950s, and also the suicide not long after of another daughter I haven't yet mentioned, Esther. And again, we'll hear more about it tomorrow. He's knighted, which really corroborates what I'm just saying. He's become part of the establishment. It's not that he's completely uncontroversial or that the knighthood perhaps isn't queried by certain people, but nevertheless, he has more or less integrated into the respectable art world of this country. So let me just give you a taste of his later works, and very powerful they are too. Here's a work that, well, you used to be able to just walk in and see it. Now I think you probably have to pay to go into the Oxford colleges, but here, Lazarus from the New Testament, of course, but I think given the date, given the proximity to the Second World War, this sort of sense of somebody in a shroud, but rising from the dead, may well have an oblique reference to the suffering of the Holocaust. And then back also to overtly Christian, well, to images of Jesus. This is a work that you can see. It's very near the main branch of John Lewis in Cavendish Square in London's West End, just slightly tucked away, so it's quite easy to miss, in a little recess here, done for a convent. Notice that kind of hieratic, again, sort of Byzantine-inspired image that he has been preoccupied with for many a long year. Llanduff, you'd have to go out of town for that, a rather remarkable, truly monumental work that he's commissioned to do in the early 50s. Again, redolent of his admiration for Byzantine art. The newly rebuilt St. Michael's Cathedral, Coventry, sorry, St. Michael's, yes, it's called St. Michael's Cathedral, isn't it? But it's called Coventry Cathedral, dedicated to St. Michael's, damaged in the war, of course, and building, it's a long process, but he, quite controversially, is commissioned to produce this rather extraordinary work to go on the facade of the new building. And Sir Basil Spence, who actually one of the building committee challenged for commissioning a Jewish artist to produce a work for this newly risen from the ashes cathedral, apparently replied, well, wasn't Jesus a Jew? More of that tomorrow and the next day. He also, and this is very powerful, I think, in the ruins of the cathedral, of Coventry Cathedral, which are still there today, they've placed a much earlier work from the 1930s, again, I mean, almost like a Easter Island figure, isn't it, of Christ bound, his arms bound, in that venue. And also, interestingly, in a totally different context, one of his latest commissions, 1958, it was the unveiling, another Pietà, again, unashamedly, primeval and primordial in its references, in the Trades Union Congress house in Bloomsbury. What's interesting, I think, about his late career, indeed, actually, this is true from really the 1920s onwards, or even before, is that he seems to be perfectly capable of working simultaneously in this emphatically primitivizing mode, and also in this very vivid but essentially naturalistic portrait bust or head mode. And just to give you a sense, I mean, he did dozens of portraits heads, very much in this style. The National Portrait Gallery has many of them. We'll see some tomorrow. Just to give you a sense of the range of his sitters, I'm obviously here dwelling on ones of particularly Jewish interest: Albert Einstein, Chaim Weizmann, and indeed Winston Churchill just after the war. So this is the other side of his more respectable, if you like, more conformist side of his work. But as you can see, they are indeed very vivid and full of life. His very last work is this one here. Some of you may have passed it in the car or, on the bus, in Knightsbridge, just on the edge of Hyde Park. Not my absolute favorite, I might as well be frank about that. But nevertheless, here is somebody who'd actually had a thrombosis prior to this. He wasn't in good health. He was working on this piece on the very day he died. Remarkable, isn't it? And he was buried, I think, interestingly, not in a Jewish cemetery, but in Putney Vale. And just on the edge of, very near the Royal Albert Hall, is a plaque on the facade of the house in which he lived for many years, as you can see, 30 years or so, also to commemorate his extraordinary life. And I'm going to end with this one here. For those of you who are not coming, as Viva said, there is one last place, but also, if you can't join us tomorrow, on the outskirts, it's in Walsall, a very easy suburban train ride from Birmingham, a gallery purpose-built to house a remarkable, truly remarkable collection donated by, at this point, Lady Epstein, in other words, Kathleen Garman, to the people of Walsall. She actually had local connections. In 1973, it was built explicitly to house not only the collection of his own work, but his collection of non-Western art, works of Lucian Freud, of Theo, and many others whose paths he crossed, and indeed other remarkable works of modern Western art from his own collection. So I hope that's whetted your appetite. I think, Aviva, I've just about finished in time for us to have some questions, if you would like to ask them. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica. What a comprehensive and thoughtful and creative as well account of his work and his life. And I love the resonances you pulled out, particularly those kind of questions and parallels with Modigliani or with Eric Gill, and kind of seeing the differences too. I think now our audience have a sense of quite why tomorrow is going to be so special, but also why it's Monica who's going to lead the visual arts part of our South of France trip in the autumn. More about that one later. But let's just go back to Epstein. I don't know if anyone else has questions. If you do, please put a note in the chat, or put up your visual hand, your digital hand, and I will bring you into the conversation. But I just wanted to ask you about whether you feel that early childhood, it clearly influenced some of the biblical material that he then chose to sculpt, but whether we know that if he reflected on it later on in his life, whether it impacted any of his choices, artistic or personal.
No,
What's
it's a
your
very valid question, one that I would expect to be asked. It's a complicated one, isn't it? I mean, as we see with Mark Gertler, or indeed, David Bomberg in the British context, or indeed, Chagall in the European, the sort of Parisian context, or indeed Sutino, not so much Modigliani, because he comes from a very different, acculturated, sophisticated Italian background. But on the one hand, it marks them forever. They never totally repudiate their origins, but it's so, in a sense, so inauspicious to becoming a westernized, sort of avant-garde artist, that actually they have to, in a sense, repudiate it, as well as remaining loyal to it in a certain way. I mean, he stopped being a practicing Jew, as indeed did nearly all these other artists we've touched on over the last few weeks, and yet he never denied his Jewishness, and indeed in certain other ways it came out in a very, in your face sort of way. Apropos Israel, I think it's quite interesting to think about that. I discovered, actually, I'd forgotten, but just doing a little bit more homework in preparation for this lecture, he actually, I don't know if he actually stipulated in his will, but soon after he died in 1959, his widow, Kathleen, actually donated a very major body of work to the Israel Museum.
Oh,
In its nascency, by the way. I mean, the Israel Museum was actually founded in the 1960s, so it actually really, kind of reinforced the importance, or the potential importance of the Israel Museum. So I think, there's a sort of sense again of not wanting to go and live there, and yet nevertheless, feeling acutely Jewish, particularly in the post-Holocaust context. Yeah.
and I was thinking so much. It was so interesting that you depicted all his different like pietas and portraits of Christ and right,
Mm.
because I mean Chagall did that. Reuben, if we want to talk
Mm.
about an Israeli artist, and this kind of thing of, on the one hand, we have to um, learn from Western art, and so much of that is Christian depiction. On the other hand, kind of this reclaiming him as a kind of Jewish figure. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on
Gosh, I mean, it's a
seen as
whole it's a whole
compared to
lecture.
Chagall. I mean, I
Yeah,
know.
no, absolutely. It's something I've been fascinated, and I've noticed that Ruta's got a hand
I'm
up,
going to
so we must
bring
let
her in a
her time.
minute.
I mean, just very briefly, I suppose. I mean, read the what's it called, for God's sake, Asher Lev. My name is Asher Lev, the Chaim Potok,
I'm Poshok, yeah.
because that is a very lovely novelistic, kind of exploration of precisely this almost intractable sort of dilemma, isn't it? You want to be an artist, as you say, Western art is teeming with images of Christ, of Jesus, one way or another. You can't turn your back on that. But Jews as the Christ killers, I don't need to say more in this context. But also, I think, particularly post-Holocaust, or from the 1930s onwards, and it's absolutely reinforced by Chagall's very complex attitude to it, and indeed Epstein, I think, as well, the sort of sense that, as Basil Spence said, in the Coventry Cathedral context, Jesus was historically a Jew. So in a sense, to reclaim him as the original Jewish martyr post-Holocaust, during the war and post-Holocaust, is a very powerful and necessarily problematic thing to do. But actually, an awful lot of people did it, not just artists, but also theologians and writers. So yes, a complicated, really interesting topic. Ruta,
Absolutely.
nice to
Let's
see you.
bring her in. Yeah.
Good.
Nice to see you too, Monica. Thank you
Bye.
very much. Thanks for this lecture. It was interesting for me because I saw Oscar Wilde sculpture, and I was in Cardiff, yes, in a cathedral. So I found that I know Epstein from that sculpture, but I didn't know about him and even didn't know a name. So that was very interesting for me. Thank you very much. And because I like Lucian Freud, and I bought for my daughter this illustration, exactly, girl with a cat,
The
kitty.
cat, she looks as though she's about to
Yeah, yeah,
strangle
yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I like it very much. So I want to ask again. So Kitty, that girl on that picture, it's Epstein daughter.
Epstein's daughter with Kathleen Garman, the woman that he was his mistress for many, many years. Absolutely, yes. I can't resist, actually. This is giving some of the game away for tomorrow, but actually, believe it or not, Lucian, who was a naughty boy, I mean, a fantastic artist, but a naughty boy, actually had an affair prior to teaming up and indeed marrying Kitty with her aunt. Kathleen's sister Lorna. I mean, really, you cannot make this up, can you? It's sort of quite extraordinary. Anyway, that's explored in that very good Cressida Connolly book that I mentioned. But yes.
Yeah, and thank you very much. And it for me was quite strange. I think that it's a Jewish sculpture create image of Jesus of a God. So this is I found very unusual. And now I start to read the book. Jewish traditional art in Lithuania. So just now start and all the history, about Jewish canon, it's impossibility of images, let's say that.
Mm-hmm.
So I found this wow for me. Nationality of a sculpture and suddenly completely Christian image, and yeah, it's very interesting.
It's completely Christian, but not in the hands of a Jewish artist. It's not, of course, completely Christian. I've got Aviva, I'm just thinking, I wrote a piece, in fact, for a magazine called Art and Christianity, precisely on this subject. I could send you the PDF to send to people
Oh yeah,
straight up if
please.
you would like. I mean, it's a difficult, but I think really interesting subject. Yeah.
What I'm
Please,
also
thank you
thinking
very
is
much.
maybe we get you back in the autumn for a talk on that
Give a talk
topic.
with pleasure. No, absolutely, with
Yeah,
pleasure. Yeah.
Thanks a lot,
fascinating.
yeah, Monica. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Rita. Um, I am very aware it's just a minute to two, and we did promise that this was meant to be a 2 o'clock ending. I could stretch it a couple of minutes, but not much more. So I'm going to ask Monica one final question, but if anyone in the audience does have further queries, I'm sure you can email her and or come on the trip and ask her tomorrow. Um, so just one last question, which is, you talked about the difference between the public artist of the big radical modern sculptures and the artist who made the kind of biographical bronzes of all those famous men, including actually later on T.S. Eliot,
All sorts. Yep.
which is fascinating.
Yep.
Do you think again that there's a difference between both those kinds of work and the kind of personal family sculptures that he did? I know a lot of which you'll see tomorrow.
I suppose the simple answer is yes. I mean, in a way, those bronze portrait heads were his bread and butter. I mean, he never saved. Apparently, he would all, you know, I think to the very end of his life, he was always worried about money. I mean, he obviously was rich and famous, and he was getting handsomely paid for the different commissions, but he lived certainly early on pretty much from hand to mouth insofar as he was kind of investing any money he might make from his art into further projects. Having said that, you know, as he progresses, sort of particularly in the 50s, but even beyond that, before that, to some extent, you know, he does make a fairly regular living from those. So some of them are obviously slightly more polite and lacking in vitality than others. And in a sense, when you look at the range of his portrait heads and busts, you can see quite clearly, almost transparently, which figures, which sitters he had most empathy with. You know, some of them are a little bit dutiful, I think one might say. Yeah. And then of course, yes, they're those wonderfully vivid. I mean, he was, as I say, he was fascinated by childhood perhaps generically, but also his own children as they grew up. So there's some wonderfully intimate, vital sculptures and indeed drawings also of his own kids as they moved through childhood. Yes, so I think inevitably there's a greater intimacy in that work. Yeah. Yeah.
And it feels to me like often they're much more like the modern public kind of Epstein than they are the careful bronzes.
Yes.
But you'll
No,
explore that, I know, tomorrow.
absolutely. Indeed. No, he's a many faceted figure, I think, as I hope I've
Yeah.
proved. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and how lucky are the people who are coming with you to hear more and see more of his work in person. And just to say that if you're not coming in person tomorrow to the Midlands, which is the first day is on Epstein and the second day German Expressionist art, you can see more of Monica by coming to the south of France with us, where she's going to look at Jewish artists like Chagall, Charlotte Salomon, some of the refugee artists and emigre artists who ended up settling around Nice and around Aix-en-Provence, but she's also going to look at people like Matisse and Picasso. So a really interesting arts trip, and I do hope you'll come along to that. But can I just say before we end, huge thank you again, because the amount of your knowledge and research I think was evident from all to see, and we are so lucky to have you on the team. So if people want to unmute themselves and just give Monica a big customary thank you,
No
round
need for
of
that.
applause.
Thanks for
Thank you very
inviting me.
much. Thank you.
Okay.
And we
Lovely.
hope to see you all again. She'll be chairing next week, next Monday.
Yes, that should be
evening.
fascinating. The House of Fragile Things is a wonderful book by James Macaulay. If you have a chance to read it before his lecture, even better. But I look forward perhaps to seeing some of you.
Yeah, and that's the French Jewish art collectors. So see you online next Monday night at 7:30.
7:30, I think it is, isn't it? Yes, very good.
Lovely.
Lovely.
All
Thank you
right.
very much.
Thank you,
All the best,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.